Jill. Welcome everyone to today's Bridge event. You have heard from Jill. This event today is really to engage around 21st century skills and the Common Core. We're going to present research and practice perspectives. As Jill pointed out, we have with us Dr. Joan Herman from the University of California, Los Angeles. We have Heather Perry, who is a superintendent from a Maine Regional School Unit, number 3 here in Maine, and Heather is also a member of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance. Joining her from RSU 3 is Deborah McIntyre, the Assistant Superintendent in that district. We also have discussants from MSAD 72. Rhonda Poliquin is a member of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance, as well as being principal of the new Suncook School in Lovell, Maine. Joining her will be an elementary teacher in her school, Courtney Smith. What we will do is to engage with Joan, and I welcome you to think of questions and add those to the chat as we go along. After Joan's presentation, and we will stop multiple times for question and answer, we will then engage with our discussants from the Rural Alliance. The Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance is co-facilitated by myself and Dr. Harunabad, as Jill pointed out. Our goal of this alliance is to support research that is specifically addressing rural schools and districts' efforts to ensure student success. We really want to look at and engage around research that is specific to the issues of these rural schools and districts. In 2012, we came together and engaged around what the priority issues of rural schools were, and 2 areas that came out really quite strongly in that work were the structures to support efficiencies, effectiveness, and equity. And within that, we did talk a lot about and have research agenda items around looking at how technology can be used to provide additional access and equity. We also prioritized the relationships between schools and communities in these rural areas. Works in progress. We're currently in the middle of a study called Gearing Up to Teach the Math Common Core, What Are Educators' Needs and Online Resources in the Rural Northeast. We're currently doing a series of surveys and interviews to identify those needs and challenges faced by rural educators. As they, I consider myself as the Taruna part of the we in this process, really looking at how can we find out what is important in terms of needs, but also the challenges to help support the integration of Common Core standards. As I mentioned briefly, make sure to take the time to type into the chat. As Joan is talking, we will be collecting those questions and pose those to her as we pause at different times throughout the presentation. So just a little more information about Dr. Herman. Dr. Herman is a senior scientist at the National Center for Research on Evaluation, Standards, and Student Testing, CRESST, at UCLA. Her research explores the effects of accountability and assessment on schools and teachers and the design of assessment systems to support educational improvement. Her recent work has focused on the quality and consequences of teachers' formative assessment practices and the assessment of 21st century skills. She also has recently chaired the National Research Council's workshop on the assessment of 21st century skills and is a member of the NRC Consensus Project on defining deeper learning and 21st century skills. Welcome, Dr. Herman.
Thanks very much, Pam, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm really honored to be here with you all today. These, of course, are both very exciting and very challenging times for assessment and learning in the United States. We've embarked on a new adventure with a Common Core, and I think 21st century skills are part and parcel of the journey we're on. I suspect you agree. Otherwise, I suspect you wouldn't be listening in to this webinar. So to preview my plan today, I'll start with a brief overview of what 21st century skills mean to me, sharing the definition from a recent report of the National Research Council, which Pam mentioned, and of which I was a part. Then I'll share how and why these skills inevitably intersect with the Common Core state standards and the new science standards, and summarize what I think research tells us are principles for developing and assessing 21st century skills. I'll emphasize the role of assessment in supporting student learning, both formative and summative assessment, and emphasize the need for coherence between the two. Finally, I'll share some examples of assessments that integrate the Common Core and 21st century skills, some of which mirror the performance assessments that both PARCC and Smarter Balanced plan to implement. So I give credit where credit is due. As I mentioned, much of my perspective comes from my participation in the recent NRC panel and report, Education for Life and Work, Developing Transferable Knowledge and Skills for the 21st Century. You may want to get your hands on the volume for more information. You can get it on the web. You can actually download it from the web if you're patient. So what are 21st century skills? We're nearly drowning in terms that have been put forward to capture the types of knowledge and skills that our students need to be successful in this changing world and what we as a country need for global competitiveness. 21st century skills, deeper learning, soft skills, non-cognitive variables, among others. The National Research Council grappled with the conflicting terminology and tried to clarify it. We ended up defining 21st century competencies as transferable knowledge and skills that enable individuals to use their knowledge across a wide variety of circumstances and in authentic real-world challenges. Students who have transferable knowledge can use it to solve problems, can use it to communicate their understandings, and can use it to collaborate across a variety of contexts. Clearly, 21st century competencies are not new. They're the same capabilities that led to the success in the 19th and the 20th century. As an example, John Dewey's work emphasized the whole child nearly a century ago, as did Maria Montessori's. Complex thinking, problem solving, innovation, communication, collaboration, leadership, persistence, motivation, these have always been the characteristics of those who advanced and were most successful in our society. Nor, another myth, are 21st century competencies independent of subject matter. They develop hand in hand with it, and research across a whole variety of domains clearly supports this assertion. Finally, 21st century skills require deeper learning of subject matter, and deeper learning of subject matter occurs when it is embedded in 21st century skills. So how we engage kids in learning definitely influences the extent to which kids can use their knowledge and the extent to which they are able to develop what we are calling 21st century competencies. So the NRC reviewed available theory on many, many, many variables that are thought to be important in learning and performance. And in order to make sense of this research relative to whether and how to teach these things, we organize these many constructs into three major buckets. Number one, cognitive skills, such as problem solving, innovation, critical thinking, reasoning. Secondly, interpersonal skills, such as communication and collaboration and leadership. And then the third bucket was intrapersonal skills, the predispositions and skills such as self-management, motivation, and persistence, more of the affective side of learning that enables us to persist and to learn. While we define 3 buckets of skills, we emphasize the strong interdependencies between the 3. This picture is meant to portray that 21st century competencies really don't exist separately or independent of one another, and most productively are developed together. For example, you can't solve vexing problems or create innovation without persistence. You will not be a good collaborator if you don't have the knowledge to collaborate, both the knowledge and skills to be a good collaborator and at least some relevant content knowledge for solving the problem that the group faces. One set of capabilities and predispositions fuels the other. For example, success in innovation or problem solving builds motivation and positive well-being. This persistence and conscientiousness, in turn, fuels success in school and work. Research also shows how collaboration can support students' learning, and ample theory and research in cognitive psychology demonstrates the value of communication in supporting student learning. For example, explaining core principles to yourself and others has major benefits for cognitive learning and transfer. 21st century competencies and subject matter do not make sense in isolation. They must be intertwined purposefully in teaching and learning. They're there anyway, so we might as well recognize it. And in fact, we find evidence of this interlocking in the Common Core State Standards and in the newly published science standards. All 3 standards documents, English Language Arts, Mathematics, and Science, emphasize inquiry, problem solving, discourse analysis, and argumentation, capabilities that fall clearly into both the interpersonal and the cognitive domains. And if you've looked at the sample items and tasks from PARC and from Smarter Balance, you'll see that their assessments will call on these skills. Further, while this is particularly the case for the performance tasks that both consortia plan, you'll find deeper reasoning, modeling, explanation, and synthesis embedded throughout both consortia's summative assessments. In addition, even though collaboration, teamwork, and intrapersonal competencies such as persistency and self-efficacy are not so visible in the standards, they well may be key to achieving the rigorous goals of the Common Core. So the bottom line is that 21st century skills and Common Core state standards and science standards not only may be developed together, they must be developed together because the Common Core state standards require them, as will new state assessments. Obviously, if 21st century competencies are valued, they must be incorporated explicitly into our classroom learning goals, and students must be provided the opportunity to learn them. This picture is meant to suggest the complex intertwining of cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal learning goals that underlies effective education. Classroom teaching and learning must artfully braid together these various competencies and those for subject matter development in English, math, science, social studies, and other subject areas. In addition to suggesting the 21st century skills and Common Core state standards must be intertwined, research also provides strong guidance for how to do so, in fact, how to develop 21st century competencies. I think one finding that bears particular underscoring is this: 21st century skills are teachable. All students are capable of deeper learning, reasoning, and problem solving. It's not just a matter of basic ability, and we don't have to wait for students to acquire basic skills to engage them in complex thinking and reasoning. Research, in fact, shows that even preschool students can understand scientific phenomena and learn to reason effectively in science. Research also provides guiding principles for the design of effective instruction for developing 21st century skills. Unfortunately, I don't really have time to share these in depth today, but 2 principles are particularly relevant for what I'm going to be talking about. And that is, number 1, as I've already said, 21st century skills cannot be developed independent of subject matter. And secondly, something close to my heart, instruction and an assessment are inseparable in their development. So let's talk about the relationship between assessment, learning, and instruction, and how standards-based reform here in the United States is supposed to work. Whether it be a lesson, a unit, a quarter, or an academic year, you start with the specifics of the learning goals you're trying to achieve. And in the current context, we're talking about learning goals that incorporate both academic content and 21st century skills. You then systematically design and use classroom instruction and ongoing classroom assessment to enable students to achieve the goals, and then use summative assessment, usually a more formal measure, at the end of the sequence to evaluate how successful you and your students have been. Results from the summative assessment also provide data that teachers and students can use to improve subsequent teaching and learning. Research, as well as common sense, tell us that it is classroom teaching and learning that is most important for improving student achievement. And here the intertwining of instruction and assessment, particularly formative assessment, is complete. Effective instructional design starts with clear learning goals and an understanding of both where students are starting relative to those goals and the pathway through which they will need to travel to get to where they need to be. This is the essence of a learning progression, a clear picture of where students are starting and a clear picture of the en route knowledge and skills that students must accomplish to get to the desired endpoint. Effective instruction engages students in principled interactions, instructional activities, that will help propel students' progress through that progression. Each activity, if it's well designed, elicits student responses, which not only help students to learn, but also through their responses we can see the status of their learning. For example, when teachers engage students in discussions or pose questions for homework, the prompts elicit responses that teachers can use to understand where students are in their understandings, and that teachers can then use that evidence to provide students feedback and, where needed, to scaffold and cue their progress forward. Assessment and instruction support a continuous spiral of effective learning. So let's consider what this means over the course of a year. You start with learning goals, blending content standards and 21st century skills, and knowledge of where students are starting relative to those goals. You lay out a progression of how students will get from where they are to the goals you expect, and you may well backward map to do so. But the bottom line is that you lay out a pathway for teaching and learning and then systematically design or adapt classroom instruction and assessment to fuel students' continuous and successful travel along that path. Getting down to a more detailed picture of how a coherent assessment system helps to propel that smooth journey, consider starting from where students actually are relative to the goals you have for them. You engage students in instructional activities that will help students to build the knowledge and skills they need to move forward on the pathway you've laid out. You use student responses in instruction, classroom discussion questions, journal entries, individual classroom assignments, homework, and the like to gauge how they're doing. Are students learning what was immediately expected? What, if any, misconceptions are they experiencing? And where you find gaps or misunderstandings, you and students take action to fix them. These interactions are the multiple colored bubbles that percolate learning. You then use formal intermediate assessments aligned with the bigger goals you are targeting to gain a more official picture of how students are doing, and use those data to further support students who need it, as well as to evaluate and improve instruction next time around. We interactively and systematically build stepping stones to propel students ever forward toward expected learning goals and to the end-of-year goals and college preparedness. This, in fact, is the nature of the systems that both PARC and Smarter Balanced are developing. While both consortia are focusing primarily on their end-of-year summative assessments, by which they'll gauge the extent to which students are on track to college readiness, they also are including in their systems interim measures and diagnostic or formative assessment tools or strategies.
Thank you, Joan. This is an opportunity for folks to introduce some questions, and while additional participants are typing in questions, Joan, a couple of questions came in as people were logging on. One of them asked that you address the connection between special education and 21st century skills and also the Common Core. And so really thinking about how we provide access to these 21st century skills for special education students. I think one thing that you mentioned was clearly important, and that is that we don't have to wait for all basic skills to be addressed before engaging students in higher order thinking. But if there are other thoughts you have toward that question, that would be great.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, all children and teachers are held accountable for the intention is that the Common Core standards are for almost all students, and those embed 21st century skills. It is also the case that not only special education students, but English learners may need special consideration to have access to 21st century skills. And an example of that for special education, for example, if students have limited reading ability, we can read the material to them and then use the material that they are listening to where the material is at the appropriate level for the student to engage kids in thinking and reasoning.
Great.
So we alter essentially the stimulus or the materials that we're asking kids to respond to, but we still engage them in the process.
Great. We just had an additional question here that Sarah posted about decontextualized formative assessments that don't come from the teacher in the classroom who knows her students best. So could you provide a little thought about formative assessment and what that might look like? In your diagram, you talked about really integrating that all along the pathway there.
Yeah, well, I think the question is well taken, and I'll go back to the picture. The idea is those percolating bubbles are what happens during the course of instruction, and all that is created by teachers. And I think whoever posed the question is quite right. You can't have formative assessments that drop from the sky and are external to your curriculum. They've got to be deeply embedded in your curriculum. That's sort of the nature of the formative assessment process. There are those who call interim or benchmark assessments formative, and in fact, if they help teachers, schools to diagnose kids' strengths and weaknesses, the results of those tests can be used formatively, and those might be more drop from the sky kinds of measures, but that isn't what the essence of formative assessment really is.
Thanks. One other question that was posted as people were joining us has to do with the connection between standards and actual classroom practice. And I'm going to wait on that question because we have with us both principals and teachers, a principal and a teacher here to talk about what they're doing in their classroom and ask additional questions. So we can maybe address that at that point. So thank you. And as additional questions come in, I will keep track of those and pose them again to you, Joan. Thanks.
So we're ready to move forward?
We are.
Okay. So is that creating these systems complicated? Is it complicated to integrate content in 21st century skills? Is it complicated to meet the needs of all students? Certainly. But isn't it what good teachers really are already doing in differentiating instruction and helping children to reach their potential? They may simply be doing it more intuitively rather than more formally. And so part of the nature, I think, of new assessment systems and indeed a formative assessment is being more explicit about how reflective you're being and be more explicit about your goals and how you're judging your progress. But let's get more concrete about what assessment that integrate 21st century skills and academic content could look like. And let me share one of the assessment models that CRESST has developed, which we call the Integrated Learning Assessment, or the ILA. The ILA assesses multiple learning goals, including those for students' content acquisition, literacy development, critical thinking, and communication. Of note, the ILA corresponds pretty well to the ELA performance tasks that both PARCC and Smarter Balance are planning to use. The examples I'll be showing you are for middle school and high school content courses, for example, history, U.S. history, world history, science, biology, social studies, and the like. Each assessment, each individual assessment, is focused on a core concept or principle for a given course. The assessment asks students to read a variety of authentic tasks related to the selected topic, to respond to reading comprehension, synthesis, and critical analysis questions, and finally, to respond to an expository or persuasive writing prompt that asks students to connect what they've read to what they already knew based on what they've learned in their course to solve a new problem involving that same given concept or principle. So they're extending their understanding of the concept or the principle. Student essays are then evaluated based on a rubric that is aligned with specific learning goals. The ILA is essentially, as you probably have figured out by this point, a reading, analysis, and writing, or it could be an oral presentation task, that can be laid in different grades or different content areas. One design comprises a 2-day summative task, which could be appropriate for a summative assessment at the end of a unit, or it could be designed for the end of a semester or the end of a year. On day 1, students read 2 to 5 new texts related to the core content, concept, or principle. And we use a variety of text types, authentic tasks such as journals, newspaper articles, editorials, political cartoons. We include, where appropriate, maps, figures, tables, and graphics. As I've said, students respond to comprehension, synthesis, and analysis questions about these individual texts and about ideas across them, which also prompts students to help assure that they will have the knowledge they need to complete the day 2 presentation task. On day 2, students respond to an extended writing prompt, also aligned with the Common Core. Here you see an example from U.S. history focused on the causes of World War I. The example starts by giving students an advanced organizer of what to expect. And you see here the actual student directions. This is a 2-part assessment. In part 1, you will have 45 minutes to go over the directions, read the materials, and answer questions. In part 2, you will have 45 minutes to write an essay on the topic. You will be asked about the United States participation in World War I. As you read the materials, please consider the reasons for why the U.S. entered World War I. So we give from the very beginning, we give kids the idea, the big ideas that we want them to focus on as they do their reading. The directions go on to tell students that they will be reading texts, which are adapted here from authentic documents in U.S. history, and present conflicting viewpoints on the factors at play and about why the U.S. entered World War I. On day 2, The argument writing task instructions tell students that on April 2, 1917, President Wilson urged Congress to declare war on Germany. He claimed that the United States should enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. Others, such as Senator George W. Norris, felt that the U.S. entered the war for different reasons than those set forth in Wilson's speech. Write a formal essay arguing whether or not the preservation of democracy was the primary reason for U.S. entry into World War I. Be sure to blah, blah, blah. So we give kids cues on what's expected in the essay, and also give them a simplified version of the rubric by which their work will be evaluated. And the detailed rubric you see here. Essentially, students' essays are scored based on the extent to which they demonstrate an understanding of World War I, lay out an effective argument with claims and counterclaims, present a logical and well-organized essay, cite relevant evidence to support their arguments, and use proper punctuation, spelling, and grammar. Or more generally, the overall rubric dimensions address content understanding and rhetorical structure and quality. Students' essays also are graded based on organization, use of evidence, and grammar and conventions. Each of these dimensions, of course, has direct instructional implications. And here's an example of what this performance task template looks like in science, focused on osmosis, a key biology concept. As with the history example, students initially are given an advanced organizer so that they understand the goal and what to expect. In this assessment, you will be asked to complete a science writing task, blah, 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 blah. Like the American history example, on day 1, students read the text and respond to comprehension, critical analysis, and synthesis questions aligned with the Common Core, and on day 2 are asked to respond to an extended writing prompt, which asks them to combine their prior and their new knowledge in a new context. And here we have the CRESST scoring rubric for the science task. It uses the same general dimensions as the prior rubric, but is customized to the Common Core State Standards requirements for expository rather than argumentation. This then gives you a sense of what a summative end-of-unit or end-of-year assessment could look like based on the CRESST ILA model. I just wanted to mention quickly what the instructional and assessment moves in content classes might look like to prepare students for success on the ILA. These instructional activities are simply derived from a task analysis of the knowledge and skills that are called for in the ILAs, and each combines literacy and content understanding goals. Each also combines opportunities for teaching and learning with those for assessment and feedback. Students are engaged in instructional activities, and teachers use student responses or debrief sessions on student work to understand where students are and to take action to close any identified learning gaps. So imagine a subject matter unit in which students read text and supplementary materials about the unit content. Teachers use questions about the individual reading to query students' ability to read closely and draw inferences about content. All are consistent with the demands of the ELA Common Core State Standards. Similarly, during the unit, as students read, they are asked to take notes to identify claims and possibly counterclaims in the readings and the evidence supporting each claim. They discuss the credibility and support for the claims. Students are asked to compare and synthesize themes and perspectives across the readings. Students write about what they're reading through such things as quick writes, journal entries, and shorter essays. They get feedback from the teacher and their peers to help them improve, so that when the end of the unit assessment comes, there are no surprises, and kids have been prepared in both content and 21st century communication skills to do well on the assessment. As I've said, The ILA is one example of a CRESST assessment model that can be adapted for use in different subject areas and for different purposes. I've provided examples in history and science, but you can imagine how it might be used in health, art, geography, or almost any subject. The idea of reusable learning-based assessment designs we at CRESST think makes the process of instructional and assessment development much more efficient and cost-effective because we know that these designs work. They draw on learning principles so that they themselves support learning, and we have strong validation evidence for them. You could also adapt the model for other contexts and purposes. For example, imagine what it might look like as a design for conducting research projects, where students might even have a choice of topic, have to search for relevant evidence and produce a final individual product that was scored against rigorous criteria. I'll skip the other learning types for which CRESST has models to focus on what seems to be a very promising direction for 21st century skills development, project-based learning. Again, another context in which the ILA could apply, but before we do that, we'll move to questions and answers.
Yeah, I just wanted to have folks have a chance to ask any questions about the model itself before we kept going. So are there any additional questions that you have for Joan at this point? I know that during the registration, a number of people asked about social studies as a content, so I'm really pleased that we addressed that particular content area in an example. I've also noticed that there are folks here, teachers of mathematics as well, and as you were pointing out, Joan, I think having a common set of descriptors that are applied across different content areas, the continuity is extremely helpful for students. I'll wait just another minute or so to see if anyone else asks a question, and then we can continue on. Okay, with that, I'm gonna hand it back to you, Joan, and we can always stop. We have one more question and answer opportunity for you before we go to the practitioners in a minute as well.
Okay, thanks, Pam. So I don't really have time to really well develop this idea, but project-based learning, as you probably know, is growing in popularity because folks think it better incorporates 21st century learning competency than does traditional instruction. So rather than building to on-demand assessments, ongoing teaching and learning builds through and to a series of complex projects where students have some choice of topic or issue. Each product is evaluated according to defined rubrics that are aligned with learning goals, and a rich collection of student work is used to evaluate year-end accomplishment, again, naturally combining content and 21st century goals. As one concrete example, many of you might have heard about Portland, Maine's middle school project-based learning approach, which was highlighted recently on PBS. In fact, I wonder whether some of you in the audience perhaps are from this school. But in that feature, we heard about the problem that King Middle School students were presented with. 25% of the world's population lacks electricity. Your job, 8th graders, is to contribute to the solution of this problem. Students were to create a device that captures natural energy and transforms it into something that's useful for people in some part of the world to use. That is, a part of the world where people are currently lacking energy. Kids' initial reactions, like yours, no doubt, no way, like, I can't do this. But as part of the exponentiary learning network, kids could and did. They were engaged in an integrated 4-month program where they studied physics, learned design principles by creating robots to collect ping pong balls, by the way, learned about world challenges in social studies, and much more, all in preparation for inventing alternative energy devices that could improve people's lives. Rhode Island senior exhibitions provide another example of a project-based learning in which is specifically designed to incorporate 21st century skills. Some of you in the audience may know more about this, in fact, than I do. The idea is that students will have the opportunity to complete a major project of their own choosing where they can apply what they have learned to create a tangible product or service. The projects require that students engage in problem solving, demonstrate communication and mastery of ICT tools and techniques, and students must engage, obviously, in extensive self-management skills and in planning and completing their projects. So project demands essentially hit all of the 21st century buckets that I mentioned very early in the presentations. Students have a choice of project type through which to demonstrate their competency, and then a choice of specific topic or focus within a given project type. For example, students can choose to design a product, service, or system, such as a business plan for a student venture, a design for developing a new park or recreation area, an adaptation of software to support peer tutoring. Students can choose to troubleshoot and improve a system, such as a system for community water treatment, or the improvement of a curriculum unit. Or, third choice, they can plan and organize an event or activity, such as a voter registration guide, a community festival or business exposition, an exhibition of student artwork. Students produce written and oral reports of the project and defend their work in a public exhibition. Students' projects are then evaluated based on rubrics that address a range of specific learning outcomes. Rubrics are customized for each project type to address the quality of the applied learning, the quality of the content presented, the quality of the writing, the quality of the use of ICT, and the quality of the oral presentation. For example, the rubric for designing a service addresses the sophistication of the design ideas that students present, their rationale for the design choices they made, the criteria by which they propose the design be evaluated, the thoroughness of their implementation plan, and the quality of their evaluation of the idea. Here you see criteria that are used to evaluate the quality of the written product produced. And I'm sure if you read quickly, you can see many connections to the Common Core state standards here. And as a final example, I provide one of England's General Certificate of Secondary Education certificates, a certificate that is expected of most all 10th graders in England. Students have some choice of courses, but each comes with specific assessment requirements. The project I'm sharing is part of course requirements for an ICT course, and this project accounts for up to 60% of students' final grades. You'll see that it presents an authentic scenario and involves students in a full range of 21st century skills. Here's the presenting problem. Litchfield Promotions works with over 40 bands and artists to promote their music and put on performances. The number of bands they serve is gradually expanding. Litchfield needs to be sure that each performance will make enough money to cover all the staffing costs and overhead involved in the production, as well as to make a product. Many people need to be paid, the bands, sound engineers, and lighting technicians. There also is the cost of hiring the venue. Litchfield Promotions needs to create an ICT solution to ensure that they have all the necessary information and that it is kept up to date. Their solution will show income, outgo, and profits. Candidates need to first work with others to plan and carry out research to investigate how other companies have produced a solution to this problem. Secondly, They need to summarize their findings and recommend a solution that addresses the task requirements and produce a design brief incorporating timescales, purpose, and target audience. The solution requirements are that the software can be modified to be used in a variety of situations. It must have a user-friendly interface. It must be suitable for the target audience, and it has to be fully tested. And there are a variety of other requirements for the individual student productions. So a very challenging project, a very authentic project, and if students in other countries are required to develop such skills, we're doing our children a disservice if we ignore them. So, in summary, here are some principles that I've tried to address. Number one, start with clear goals for 21st century learning and models of how learning is expected to develop. Identify performance expectations that integrate content and 21st century competencies. Identify benchmarks along the way that will be both targets of instruction and juncture points for formative and formal assessment of whether students are achieving expected goals en route. We know that learning doesn't often develop without relevant instructional support, so we need to work through the specific instructional strategies and activities that will support student progress towards ultimate goals. Teaching and learning activities should be designed also to provide systematic evidence of whether and how students are progressing, and that evidence needs to be used to take immediate action to close any identified gaps. That is, engage in ongoing formative assessment. Finally, use summative assessment to reflect on, refine, and improve curriculum and instruction, and to keep in mind what gaps need to be filled as students move forward. I think we all know there are a number of challenges in bringing this vision to reality, to put it mildly. Teacher capacity is probably number one. This vision is different from what most teachers have been trained to implement. We know from research that teachers may need support to develop their content knowledge and their assessment and pedagogical knowledge. And teachers need instructional resources and tools that can help them and their students to develop the skills they need. Secondly, incentives and motivation. If there are no stakes attached, how and will teachers and students pay attention? Educators and students need to understand the role of 21st century skills in the Common Core and how they will be reflected in consortia tests, at least as a starting point for motivation. Thirdly, and this comes back to a point we discussed earlier, educators need to understand that all students can be engaged in 21st century learning. Yes, it will be challenging for English learners and students with disabilities, and I know that some of you are worried about this. We need to adapt or accommodate the topics and materials which are the source of some students' 21st century engagement. For example, if we are interested in developing reasoning and problem-solving skills, but are worried about EL's ability to read materials, we can use read-aloud technologies and glossaries and other language supports to help alleviate the language barrier. If we are interested in supporting mathematical thinking and problem-solving, we can choose mathematical concepts and topics from prior years, concepts and principles that the students are familiar with on which to base the reasoning and problem-solving activity. 21st century skill development does not need to wait and should not wait for basic skills development. The one fuels the other. And think of the alternative. I know that I would die of boredom if my day were comprised only of basic skills development and not of the ideas and applications that those skills open up. Time and available resources certainly are an issue. Instructional time, assessment time, teacher time, resources to help support changes in teacher practice, available professional development and coaching support to achieve quality, instructional resources including syllabus and models for integration. And yes, scale up will be a bear, and the list could probably go on and on. But again, what's the alternative? And with that, I say thank you for your attention, and let's get to more questions.
There are a number of questions that have been posed in this last section, so I'm going to provide those to you, Joan, at this point. So Sapna typed in that you mentioned self-management skills. Could you discuss how metacognition and metacognitive skill levels play a role in your examples that you provided?
Well, I think that metacognition and metacognitive skill really comes into play in project-based learning, where kids are given responsibility to plan and implement their projects on a given schedule, and where they have they have checkpoints along the way where they can assess their progress and get help where necessary to catch up. So I think project-based learning itself is a strategy for developing metacognitive and planning skills, and for involving kids in self-evaluation, which is so central in metacognitive skills.
There was a question here about shouldn't these metacognitive skills be assessed, and how are they assessed?
Well, I think there are always a variety of ways one can assess kids' skills. For me, you can, one way is to actually engage kids in self-reflection or self-evaluation and see how well they're able to do it. So as part of project-based learning, at key progress points along the way, we could ask students to actually evaluate how they've done thus far and what they could do to be better. And that would be an opportunity to both build metacognitive skills and see how sensitive kids are being. There are other ways. Researchers use self-report surveys of am I a good planner? Do I stop along the way? How well do I use evidence and the like? I'm not a particular fan of those kinds of self-report measures, but they certainly exist. But I think that the critical point is being clear on what you mean by metacognitive skills, and then create a situation which will essentially expose those skills. And in that exposure, you can evaluate those skills.
Right. There's a question here that Steve posed about how study skills curriculum can be best aligned to the Common Core and 21st century skills.
Well, I think I feel like I'm being a little repetitive. I think when you engage students in larger projects, it involves planning, and much of what comes under the rubric of some people's version of study skills. When when I talked about the ILA as a model and what the instruction leading up to it might look like, you could imagine study skills kinds of activities being embedded in that sequence. We in education we're great about using terms, and so I don't know exactly what's in the mind of the person who posed the question when they use the term study skills.
Yes, Steve, you could you could actually add more in the chat if you want to clarify that for Joan further. In the meantime, there was a question here specifically asking if there are any special considerations or recommendations you have that apply to pre-K and the primary grades around 21st century skills.
I don't think I have any special ideas or strategies, because that's not an area of my special, that I know a whole lot about, to tell you the truth. But I think in general the same strategies work regardless of grade level. It's just the sort of the complexity of the problem that you're asking kids to grapple with.
There was a question here. There was a question both upon registration and also one here about a lot of these strategies that you've presented seem and competencies seem to be those that would work well in the 19th century. And what is 21st century about these particular skills, and how is that embedded in the learning process? I think you did a nice job laying that out, but is there anything that you want to add there? Nancy asked this question.
Quite frankly, I don't think there is anything new between what we call 20th century skills. Those of us who have been around in the field for long remember HOTS, higher order thinking skills. That was back in the 80s or the 90s. So, as long as we've been educating children, we've been worried about building thinkers. What's different now, of course, is that we believe that all kids, not that I didn't believe before that all kids should be exposed to these skills, but the economic reality is that thinking, problem solving, learning to learn, adaptive problem solving, collaboration are what all kids need to be able to earn a livable wage, essentially. The jobs that are more rote are going away. They're being taken over by robots or computers, or being outsourced. So to be successful and successful not only economically but successful as a citizen, you need these skills.
And one last question before we turn to our practitioners to provide some input here. There's one question specifically around the place of integrated curriculum in project-based learning.
Well, as I've tried to show with the examples, I think that there definitely is a place, and the New Hampshire example is the perfect example of a project-based orientation that is integrated across curriculum areas. The solving the energy problem of a portion of the world that where people don't currently have energy. That was a project that involved, I believe, almost every course that kids were engaged in.
And I would also add that the work that's being done in Portland, in King Middle School, they integrate across the curricula. So they include lots of examples of using math and science and writing and reading as part of those projects. And I also heard when you were talking about the music example, the importance for the kids to identify the cost of the product, and it's a whole integrated curriculum within that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging design problem to make sure that the project and the activities in which kids engage really hit all the knowledge and skills we want them to develop. But I think I'm probably partial to project kinds of integrated curriculum on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that's, that's a choice. There's not one way to do any of this.
Great. Well, that's a good segue to our practitioners, because we have some folks here that have been doing a lot of work around personalized learning opportunities, standards-based grading and standards-based assessment more broadly. And so I'm going to introduce, again, Heather Perry is the superintendent of a Maine regional school unit, a very vast area with many small rural schools. And joining her is Deborah McIntyre, the assistant superintendent. Heather, could you provide a little bit of background about what's going on in your district, specific to 21st century skills and personalized learning? And then you could perhaps either take questions from participants or pose questions to Joan as well.
Sure. Thank you, Pam. Again, my name is Heather Perry. I'm the superintendent of schools in RSU 3, which is in the Unity and Thorndike area of Maine. It's about 440 square miles. We have 8 schools spread out across those 440 square miles, so we're quite a widespread district. We are currently in probably our second full year of attempting to implement what we call proficiency-based educational system in our school system. We've done a lot of work with community, with staff, with students and parents around helping them to understand what a proficiency-based system of education is and what it does for students. And in our mind, again, you can get caught up in terms between standards-based, proficiency-based, mass customized. There's probably as many terms as you can think of, but for our purposes, proficiency-based education is hinged around the development of a transparent curriculum model that has students learning in progressions that are not based upon their age alone. So it's really you start at an area of learning and you progress through that learning in a transparent way, and it's not necessarily based upon a grade that's based upon your age level. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we're trying to experiment with here in RSU 3, and it's been a fun piece of work. A lot of the background work that's been the most difficult is the development of our curriculum, which is based upon measurement topics and progressions of learning, or learning targets. And we've developed a system that is got a 3-pronged approach, and I'll let Deb talk a little bit more specifics about them. But basically, if you can think of it as 3 legs of a stool, we have the content area knowledge that students have to demonstrate an understanding of before they can move forward in their learning progressions. We also have what we call habits of mind, and then we also have what we call complex reasoning skills. And each one of those areas has got learning targets kind of spelled out as to what we expect students to be able to demonstrate understandings of before they move forward to whatever the next progression is. And so that's been a lot of work, and again, we're still in the very early stages of it. If somebody were to ask me, have we actually moved to proficiency-based education, I would say no. We still have our feet kind of in both worlds between the traditional system and the proficiency-based, but we are working on it, and that's the direction that we're headed in. And I guess I'll let Deb talk a little bit more, probably in relation to the 21st century skills, about how our complex reasoning skills and habits of mind kind of play into that. So I'll turn it over to Deb.
Hi, this is Deb McIntyre, and we are a member of a cohort of schools in our state who are working together on this journey, which has been a huge help to us individually and in collaboration with everyone to help develop particularly the complex reasoning skills and the habits of mind. Heather made mention of a 3-legged stool. The vision that we use is of 3 circles, and those circles it represents the content area, the complex reasoning skills, and the habits of mind. And those 3 circles where they intersect is what we call the sweet spot, because that's where true learning and instruction should be taking place. It's not to say that sometimes you need to teach specific complex reasoning skills in isolation, because if you're asking them to apply those reasoning skills within the content, they need to understand both of those as well. We have done a lot of work with Deborah Pickering, and will continue to do so. She really has helped us to develop those reasoning processes, and our teachers are currently developing units on how those processes fit in with particular areas of their content areas. So we have a progression of learning not only for our content areas but also for those habits of mind and complex reasoning. And we know that students are always at different places, and we are hoping to develop a better understanding in our teachers about what those progressions look like during our school year next year. So if you have any questions for us, that's great.
Pam, are you still there? Lost him.
I was just asking if you had any questions for Joan. Sorry.
That's all right. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, something that, Joan was talking a lot about the need to teach 21st century skills, interrelated within content. One of the things that we're passionate about in our system that we're trying to create is that we're trying to create a system that there's a lot more student voice in what they think is a way to demonstrate an understanding of a particular skill. For example, and so Joan, this is going to get to a question here in just a second. So, for example, in our system, we have a particular learning target that we want the student to demonstrate an understanding of, and we want to be able to allow the child to demonstrate in whatever way suits them the best that they understand that particular learning target and they've met proficiency in that learning target. So, when you were talking about some of the assessments earlier, the one about osmosis, for example, one of the things that, a child, we believe strongly, is that a child might know osmosis hands down, know it inside and out, and can demonstrate that knowledge, but it might not be in writing. Maybe it's through a song. Maybe it's through a piece of artwork. Maybe it's through some sort of a program that they're working on in their local farm and an agricultural setting. So to us, I guess I'd like to hear Joan's thoughts in terms of allowing student choice in how they demonstrate understandings of some of these things in the form of assessments.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Joan?
Well, I think it's a great idea to incorporate student choice into student assessment, and it's absolutely true that a child could understand a concept, and particularly if we're dealing with special students with disabilities or English learners, if we always require that they write or speak about it, they may not be able to show what they know. So in terms of sort of providing the best context and opportunities for them to really demonstrate their knowledge, I think it's providing choices is a really good idea. I do think one has to be careful that one has definite criteria for what constitutes what constitutes accomplishment of the standard. So that if one is demonstrating one's understanding of osmosis through artwork, how does that piece of artwork, how must that piece of artwork demonstrate understanding of osmosis? Putting a circle in a circle, there probably needs to be something in addition to the artwork that where kids somehow explain, not necessarily in writing, or their understanding. Because I think in my fear in giving kids too many choices is, number one, that we actually know from research that kids aren't really very good at choosing the best way to demonstrate their skill. This goes back to there have been studies where when you give kids a choice of question, for example, that they can respond to, like you can write an essay in point A, in question A, B, or C. The research shows that kids do not necessarily make good choices, and as you might expect, the kids who are most disadvantaged by such choices are the kids who have the lowest ability. They have the toughest time making the right choice for themselves because they don't have enough knowledge to make a good choice. So I think we have to make sure that in providing kids choices of ways to exhibit their knowledge, that each of those ways has some cognitive rigor to it.
Yeah, Joan, this is Heather again. I love what you're saying in terms of being very cognizant of the taxonomy level of what you're asking students to do and demonstrate the knowledge of, and the rigor, which we use the term taxonomy because we use a lot of Marzano's taxonomy in the work that we do. And so we pay close attention to that, and that's something that that we do take a lot of effort in making sure that teachers understand what those taxonomy levels are so that they can help guide students in their choices to make sure that when a student makes a choice about how they want to demonstrate their understanding, that they are indeed meeting that level of taxonomy and rigor in the methods in which they choose to do that. And the other thing that we like about the system with more student voice and choice is that it allows students to make a choice, and maybe, you know what, maybe they do flounder. And one of the benefits of that, if a student is not successful initially, is enabled to teach them those complex reasoning skills and habits of mind around perseverance, around metacognition in terms of being able to reflect upon how they are as a learner, what they're successful with and what they're not. And so it gives them opportunities in a structured and supportive and safe way to learn those same skills in a very practical method. So I agree with you. I think the taxonomy and the rigor is extremely important, and it's something we can't lose sight of as we're going through standards in whatever form they are. So it's just, you know, how you think about students being able to make mistakes and kind of flounder, and how you think the role of the teacher in helping to facilitate that conversation with a child. I really do believe that children can make those good decisions. It may just take a little coaching to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds like a great system. I'd be curious to know sort of what kind of professional development you're providing for teachers and to enable them to do this.
Yeah, it'd be great. And you know, one of the things too, if anybody, you know, we mentioned our curriculum and the model that we have. It's actually accessible by the public online. If anybody wants to Google. It's called the Maine Cohort for Customized Learning, and on that website there's a link to our software system called Educate.
Great.
And Educate has all of our progressions of learning are located there. You can look through those.
Not the latest.
Not the latest. We've revised them, but it's a public view of. You can kind of see the model that way.
That's great.
I also see there's the question here for you, Deb, and Heather to answer in terms of the infrastructure you have in place to support the three-prong model that you discussed.
Yeah, absolutely, Pam. Again, we utilize the Educate software system. We've developed learning progressions, so measurement topics and then learning progressions in each of those three, the content areas themselves, but also with the habits of mind and with complex reasoning skills. We work closely with Deborah Pickering on the complex reasoning skills, and we work closely with Marzano Research Labs on the habits of mind. So we have those learning targets and measurement progressions, and they're on the Educate software system, and that's how our teachers access that, and that's how people can kind of access those progressions. I don't know if, Deb, you want to add anything to how we do that?
Yeah, we also have, we really have focused any of our PD on this work. So we're really very laser-like in what we choose to spend our time on because we have so limited amount of time. We do have some late start days sprinkled throughout our calendar, and that is all devoted to this work, be it around what the classroom culture is like, which is what we really focused on like last year, and then really looking at how those reasoning processes play into the specific content areas. So we're really devoting all of our time and all of our resources in terms of monetary support of conferences and outside opportunities. We have a lot of summer work going on, really supporting teachers digging more into that content area and really just focusing on the work ahead.
And I just would add one piece to the development of those measurement topics and learning progressions. That was done not just ourselves, that was done with the cohorts, the Maine cohort for customized learning, which represents how many schools now? About like 26? I think it's 26 districts in the state of Maine now, so it's a pretty large group that have been working together to create and develop and kind of vet these various learning progressions.
Thanks, you guys. There's one last question, but I'm going to hold that question until I introduce Rhonda and have a little bit more conversation about what they're doing, and then I'll come back to the additional question for you folks. So I'd like to introduce Rhonda Poliquin again, as she's a member of the Northeast Rural Districts Research Alliance Core Planning Group, as well as a principal of a small Maine school, New Suncook School in Lovell, Maine. Also with her is Courtney Smith, a teacher in grades 4 and 5. And Rhonda and Courtney are actually engaged daily in the day-to-day work of translating this to practice. When I say this, I mean assessing 21st century skills within the context of the Common Core. So Rhonda, could you give a little bit of an overview about what you all are doing in New Suncook School? And we'd love to hear from Courtney as well in terms of implementing Common Core and 21st century skills in the classroom.
Sure. A lot of our work has been focused obviously on the moving towards the Common Core standards. We have separated out on our report card the academic skills, separating them from work habits, habits of mind. A lot of those habits of mind have been developed as goals within the classroom so that they're different from classroom to classroom. I'm curious to hear more about the progression that Heather's district and the cohort have worked on as far as those learning skills are concerned, because ours are sort of developed within the classroom. And as I said, they're different from classroom to classroom. We're doing a lot of sort of individualized goal setting with students, and I'll let Courtney talk a little bit more about that, but basically sort of asking kids which piece do you want to work on next, both with academic skills and also with those work habits, and having students present evidence for how they know they've accomplished and met certain standards, trying to make, as Heather had said, try to make the standards as transparent as we can. So let Courtney talk a little bit about what that looks like translated into a classroom as well.
Hi, I'm Courtney. In the classroom, we try, I believe all the staff at New Suncook is trying really hard, like Rhonda said, to make sure that the standards are really transparent to kids, meaning that kids know exactly what standards we are going to be heading towards or gearing up towards working on, and that those standards are really pulled apart and discussed with the kids before we even begin, so they really understand the task that's being asked of them. And then students are given kind of checkpoints of how they can start progressing through these. So what is the first skill you need to be able to show or to prove that you can begin working on this or that you're making progress towards a standard? Students are given lots of opportunity in the classroom to have a say in a variety of areas. So they're not only given opportunities to make choices about the standard that they may choose in a specific content area, but they're also given the choice to decide, as Rhonda had said, what our classroom environment will look like and how it will feel in our classroom. Some of us call it our code of cooperation, that we spend a lot of time at the beginning of the year and at various times throughout the year modifying as we need to, where kids get to decide what will be the rules, so to speak, in our classroom and how it should look. And they hold each other accountable to those, and they are reported on our report cards as well. A lot of my job is putting the responsibility and the accountability back on the kids and trying to teach them to be leaders within the classroom and trying to have them have some ownership in their learning. And as we said earlier, the 21st century skills are not necessarily new skills, but what I do think as a teacher is new is really holding students and teachers accountable to students trying at least to master those skills and to have some knowledge or understanding of what is expected of them. And some of the roles that we have with the kids is that they do, as Rhonda said, need to be responsible for collecting data towards standards, presenting that data towards standards, reflecting on whether or not they feel that the data they do have is sufficient to say that they have truly mastered a specific standard. And students are given the opportunity to work independently. They're given the opportunity to work within groups. They're given the opportunity to conference with one another and give each other feedback, which I think is great for teaching them some of those leadership skills, some of those reflection skills, and even the perseverance in some ways, because they are challenging each other to go back, try it again, and challenging themselves as well. So it's not all new, but I do believe that the accountability is much higher now, and it's been an exciting time to be in the classroom.
Thanks, Courtney. If you have questions for Courtney and Rhonda, please put those in the chat. Joan, are there any reflections or comments or questions for Rhonda and Courtney at this point?
Well, I mean, I just think it's so encouraging and satisfying to hear what's happening in Maine school districts. There's really impressive bodies of work in by both sets of presenters, and it's a shame that when we hear about teachers and schools in the media, that there's such relative inattention to all the great work that's going on. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the specifics of what you all are doing, and I think I can learn a lot from you. I mean, there seems to be we're copacetic in terms of what we're thinking about, and I have a lot to learn from the specifics of how you're putting it into action.
Great. I have a few more questions, and we have just about 9 more minutes of time here, and so I want to pose this because there are a couple of questions specific to the goals of the Rural Alliance, and one it has to do with connections to community, and the other has to do with overcoming some of the issues of small schools. So I'm going to start with the second question first. It's difficult sometimes. There are challenges for rural districts that can make implementation of things such as this innovative type of work possible. How have you, Rhonda, and your district been able to overcome some of those issues of size, scheduling, and community support? And then I'm going to pose the same question to Heather and Deb.
As far as community support, as far as around this work is concerned, you mean?
Yes, as far as trying to do something different. I know that changing to a standards-based report card is a big shift for your community and school, and so how have you been able to overcome some of those difficulties of size and community, small communities and rural, geographically isolated schools?
To some extent, I think it's a double-edged sword, I think, to some extent, because we are small. We have a lot of personal connections with families, and we know them well. We've had their kids, in some cases, on to second and third generations. So I think, to some extent, we have the trust of families and the community, so we can talk to them maybe more individually than just putting it out online or having big presentations. A lot of it can be done on a more individual level, and I think that's helped a lot. I think we continue to solicit feedback from the community. The University of Southern Maine CPAIR is a research group that has been really instrumental in helping us develop surveys for parents, for teachers, and also for students to collect feedback about where we are in our work and what would help parents better understand what's happening. I think we're still in a transition of trying to find that balance of how much information is enough for parents and how much is too much or not enough. And I think it varies sometimes from parent to parent, so it is trying to find that balance. I think certainly the resources and the connection with the Maine Customized Learning Group and being able to access more resources online has been really instrumental as well. So I think it's a combination of pieces. I don't know if you have more.
Well, I think that we've also provided parents with several opportunities to come into the school and have discussions either with the classroom teacher or with the principals. There's also been community meetings where either with school board or where the community was invited to come in and talk, and we've sent out enormous amounts of information trying to make sure that any possible unanswered questions are answered.
And I think the students have been the best, probably the best ambassadors for this system. They can explain it. They're excited about it. They can talk to their parents about it. They can explain what they're learning and show how they know. So I think in a lot of ways that's been our best communicator in trying to move forward with the work.
Excellent. Heather and Deb, do you want to answer this question as well as how you're engaging parents and community members?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it, and certainly if Deb wants to add anything, she can. But first I want to echo the thought about students being the best ambassadors. They most definitely are some of the best ambassadors, and they certainly do share information with their parents around what they're doing. A lot of students are excited, although there's a lot of questions out there too, which is great to engage students in the conversation and again have them feel empowered that they are helping through the process to help make decisions about creating a system that works for them, not a system necessarily that's built upon the needs of adults. So it's great to involve the kids. They've been the best part of it, and I think they should be, and they're going to continue to be the core of it for our work. We've spent a lot of time in RSU3 working with community. We started last year with an 18-month process to develop a new mission and vision in our school. We had some community forums. We had surveys of community parents, students, and we had a working group that was established with all the key stakeholders that took a lot of that information from those feedback sessions to create our new mission and vision that's very much in line with the proficiency-based systems that we're moving towards. So that was about an 18-month process. We're now in a process where we have taken another group of stakeholders again, and we're working with those key stakeholder groups to develop a strategic plan complete with, action steps, goals, timelines, and those kinds of things. But, I mean, it's been long processes, and those are somewhat traditional models of moving a system forward, but the way that we've done it has been different. I mean, we might use some of the same terms like mission and vision and strategic plan, but they're not the same things as they used to be. They're much more focused on philosophies, beliefs. They're much more focused on engaging the conversation to create them, too. It's not just a group of people that sit down in one weekend and hammer it out. I mean, it's an ongoing conversation in our community about what we want our system to look like and be able to do for our children. So it's been a really important conversation, and so while we've been doing the dirty detail work of professional development and creation of the learning progressions and all those things, at the kind of the larger view, we've been working a lot with the community on that mission, vision, and clarifying what our system is going to do for kids. So that's my thoughts. I don't know if, Deb, you wanted to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things that Heather's done a great job at keeping the website, up to date. So that has been a great vehicle for us to reach lots of community members who may not happen to come into schools. We've also done videos of our classrooms, and since we are so spread out, we share those videos during our late start days with our staff, and that gives everyone a sense that we're all in this together. So it's not just the high school, it's not just the middle school, but it's all of us K-12 working on the work. We also had a group of students who used Tanberg to have a conversation with students out in Lindsay, California about what proficiency base looks like in their schools. So all of those things really utilize technology to help support these efforts. Excellent.
Thanks, Deb. One last question, and then I'm going to ask folks to complete the survey about this webinar. Rhonda and Courtney, did you have a link or a website that folks could get information about what you're doing?
We don't, actually, because we're in the process of updating our whole website. We're moving to a different system. A lot of our stuff isn't online. It's still being developed within individual classroom teachers' pieces. I think perhaps more at the middle school, I can send you the link for the middle school. I think there are some teachers there that are using the Educate system that Heather talked about that might, but it's not going to be as comprehensive as what Heather spoke about.
Okay, we'll add that link to this information, and folks will be getting a link to the archive after. So I want to thank all of our discussants as well as our presenter today. It's been very nice to hear both from the research side of things as well as what it looks like in practice. So once again, I appreciate all the time and effort that you've put into sharing your knowledge. Thanks again. And for those folks that are part of this webinar, if you would please go to this participant survey and provide us feedback, as we're always trying to make these events better. So thanks again, everyone.
This ends today's Bridge event. An archive will be available on the RELME website in the next few days. Thanks so much for joining today. Bye-bye.